Scarborough Shoal is a strategically critical disputed feature in the South China Sea. Tensions have risen again following the Philippine submission of official maritime charts and the delineation of territorial baseline to the United Nations.
The Philippines has formally advanced its position over Scarborough Shoal at the United Nations. China reacted strongly. Taiwan did not. And that is surprising because Taiwan also claims the shoal.
Taiwan has reaffirmed its sovereignty over Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea.
On July 12, Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs reaffirmed that its South China Sea sovereignty claims remain unchanged. Taipei again called for disputes to be resolved peacefully under international law and through dialogue, so Taiwan has not abandoned its claim. But notice the difference. Beijing has treated Scarborough as a confrontation with Manila.
黄岩岛是中国固有领土，菲律宾的领土范围由一系列国际条约所确定。黄岩岛在其领土范围之外。
Taipei has treated it as a dispute that should be managed without further escalation. Why? The answer may lie beyond Scarborough itself. Taiwan sits directly north of the Philippines, separated by the Bashi Channel. And northern Philippine territory is becoming increasingly important to the military geography of a potential Taiwan conflict. The Philippines is also a U.S. treaty ally. So Taipei has to balance two interests: protecting its territorial claim and protecting a relationship that could become strategically important. And that is the puzzle we need to understand. Why would Taiwan defend its claim to Scarborough Shoal while avoiding a major confrontation with the Philippines? To understand that calculation, we first need to look at what Scarborough actually represents. The shoal lies roughly 120 nautical miles from Luzon, putting it much closer to the Philippines than to Taiwan. Yet China has maintained effective control around it since 2012, using Coast Guard and other maritime forces to restrict Philippine access. And that creates the first major strategic imbalance. Taiwan has the claim. The Philippines has the proximity. China has the presence. The 2016 arbitration ruling adds another layer. The tribunal did not decide sovereignty over Scarborough Shoal itself, but it ruled that the shoal does not generate an exclusive economic zone and found that China had violated traditional Philippine fishing rights there. So this is not simply a question of who claims the shoal. It is a question of who can actually operate around it. And right now, those are very different things. Taiwan retains its claim. The Philippines remains the geographically closest claimant with direct maritime interests. But China has the strongest operational position. And that gap between legal claims and control is what makes Taiwan's response so interesting. This distinction is critical. Taiwan has not abandoned its claim to Scarborough Shoal. Its position is explicit. Taipei says its sovereignty claims and policies concerning the South China Sea remain unchanged. And it continues to insist that Taiwan must be included in regional discussions. So why does Taipei sound more restrained than Beijing? Because defending a claim is not the same as escalating a dispute. Taiwan can say, "We claim this territory," without saying, "We will confront Manila over it." That allows Taipei to preserve its position while keeping relations with the Philippines from becoming another strategic problem. And that matters because Taiwan's primary security challenge is China. The Philippines, meanwhile, is becoming increasingly important to Taiwan's wider security environment. So Taipei has an incentive to keep the Scarborough dispute from damaging a relationship it may need in a future crisis. In simple terms, the claim remains firm. The strategy becomes flexible. Taiwan may be practicing legal persistence without strategic confrontation. And that distinction is what makes its response to Scarborough so interesting. And this is where the geography changes the story. Taiwan sits directly north of the Philippines. Between them is the Bashi Channel, a major maritime passage connecting the South China Sea with the Western Pacific. And sitting right beside that channel is Batanes. The islands are less than 90 miles from Taiwan. That makes the northern Philippines strategically important in a way that has very little to do with Scarborough Shoal itself. In April and May 2026, U.S. And Philippine forces demonstrated exactly why. During Balikatan, the United States deployed its Mises anti-ship missile system to Batanes. The system can strike surface ships from land at ranges of roughly 185 kilometers. More than 17,000 troops participated in the exercises, while U.S. and Philippine forces also conducted maritime strike drills in Itbayat, only about 155 kilometers from Taiwan. And this was not simply a weapons demonstration. The exercises rehearsed how forces could secure and defend key maritime terrain in the northern Philippines. That matters to Taiwan because Batanes sits at the southern entrance to the Bashi Channel. And in a conflict, controlling that passage could affect whether Chinese naval forces can move between the South China Sea and the Western Pacific. One former Philippine Navy commander put it bluntly, "We should have the ability to deny the Chinese control of the Bashi Channel." So look at the map, Taiwan-Bashi Channel, Batanes, Luzon. Suddenly, the Philippines is no longer just a neighboring claimant in the South China Sea. It is part of the military geography surrounding Taiwan. And there is another layer to this. The Philippines is not acting alone. It is a U.S. treaty ally, and American military cooperation with Manila has expanded dramatically. Washington now has access to 9 Philippine military sites under EDCA, while U.S. and Philippine forces conduct increasingly frequent exercises across the archipelago. Reuters reported that the two countries agreed to more than 500 joint engagements for 2026. The northern Philippines has therefore become part of a much larger American strategy. Reuters reported that U.S. deployments to Batanes are intended, among other things, to help deny Chinese naval access to the Western Pacific in a Taiwan conflict. And the military logic is becoming increasingly visible. China's aircraft carrier Shandong has itself used the Bashi Channel to enter the Western Pacific. So the same waterway that Beijing needs for naval operations is one that Washington and Manila are preparing to deny. That creates a simple strategic triangle: Taiwan, Philippines, United States. For Taipei, this matters enormously, because if a Taiwan conflict ever begins, the Philippines could become important for military access, logistics, evacuation, and the movement of forces. Manila is already preparing for that possibility. Philippine authorities have contingency plans for evacuating Filipino workers from Taiwan, while Batanes is being considered as a potential staging point for evacuation and humanitarian operations. So Taiwan now has another reason to avoid an unnecessary confrontation with Manila. It can maintain its claim to Scarborough Shoal, but it also needs to preserve its relationship with a country whose geography could become critical during a Taiwan crisis. And that is the strategic trade-off. Taiwan does not have to abandon its claim to work with the Philippines.
In a rare visit, a Philippine delegation has traveled to Taiwan for a maritime forum.
It simply has to decide how much political capital it is willing to spend defending that claim. And with China as the much larger threat, Taipei may have decided that this is one dispute it cannot afford to let become strategically bigger than it already is. Now we can see why this matters to Taiwan. Imagine a crisis across the Taiwan Strait. China launches a blockade or attempts to attack Taiwan. Suddenly, the Philippines is no longer watching the conflict from the sidelines. Its geography puts it directly inside the strategic picture. The Bashi Channel becomes critical. It connects the South China Sea with the Western Pacific, and Chinese naval forces have already used it to move into the Pacific. At the same time, U.S. and Philippine forces are practicing how to deny that passage in a conflict. That could make the northern Philippines important for surveillance, logistics, reinforcement, maritime access, and evacuation. And Manila is already preparing for one very practical consequence. There are around 200,000 Filipinos in Taiwan, and Philippine authorities are developing contingency plans to evacuate them if war breaks out. Batanes could potentially serve as a staging and logistical hub for that effort. So the Philippines may not be able to remain neutral in a Taiwan conflict even if it wants to. President Marcos has already said that if war breaks out over Taiwan, the Philippines could be dragged into the conflict because of its proximity, and that creates a completely different calculation for Taipei. The question is no longer simply who owns Scarborough Shoal. It becomes who will help shape the strategic environment around Taiwan if a crisis begins. And on that question, the Philippines could become extremely important. That is why Taiwan has a reason to preserve its relationship with Manila even while maintaining its own territorial claim. And here is the paradox. China's pressure on the Philippines may actually make the Philippines more valuable to Taiwan. Look at what is happening. China pressures Philippine vessels around Scarborough. Beijing objects to Manila's cooperation with Washington. The Philippines responds by strengthening its military partnerships and expanding its ability to operate with the United States and other regional partners. And as that happens, Manila becomes more strategically important in the wider security environment around Taiwan. The cycle looks like this. Chinese pressure Philippine insecurity, stronger US. Philippine cooperation, greater strategic importance of the Philippines, greater value of Manila to Taiwan. This is not simply theory. Reuters has reported that US and Philippine forces are rehearsing the use of anti-ship missiles in Batanes to deny Chinese naval access through the Bashi Channel. At the same time, Chinese naval forces have been using that same channel to reach the Western Pacific. So the Philippines is increasingly becoming a strategic hinge between the South China Sea and Taiwan. And that creates a problem for Taipei. Taiwan still has a territorial claim against the Philippines. But China is the country that poses the existential security threat to Taiwan. If confrontation with Manila weakens a relationship that could become critical during a Taiwan crisis, Taipei gains very little. So Taiwan's restraint around Scarborough may not mean that the claim has become unimportant. It may mean something more strategic. Taipei is trying to prevent a secondary territorial dispute from damaging a relationship that could become critical in the primary confrontation, the one with China. And that is where Scarborough stops being just a dispute over territory. It becomes a question of strategic priorities. For years, the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea were treated as separate strategic problems. Increasingly, the map says otherwise. Look at the geography. Taiwan, Bashi Channel, northern Philippines, Luzon, South China Sea. The Bashi Channel connects the South China Sea with the Western Pacific, while Batanes sits on its southern edge, less than 90 miles from Taiwan. And military planning is catching up with that geography. US. And Philippine forces are practicing the use of land-based anti-ship missiles in Batanes to deny Chinese naval access through the channel. Reuters reported that these systems could be used against Chinese forces attempting to blockade or attack Taiwan. China, meanwhile, is using the same corridor. In June, the Chinese carrier Shandong and its escorting ships sailed through the Bashi Channel into the Western Pacific. So, the strategic picture is changing. The South China Sea is no longer only about disputed reefs and maritime claims. The Philippines is increasingly becoming a southern gateway into the Taiwan theater. And that means a country does not need to be a formal Taiwan security partner to become strategically important to Taiwan. The Philippines is increasingly becoming exactly that. But there is an important limit to this argument. Taiwan cannot simply abandon Scarborough Shoal. Its official position remains unchanged. Taipei continues to claim sovereignty over the South China Sea islands and insists that its rights must be respected and that Taiwan should be included in regional dispute mechanisms. And Taiwan has its own strategic interests in the South China Sea, particularly around Taiping Island, its largest naturally occurring feature in the Spratlys. So Taipei cannot suddenly endorse Manila's entire territorial position without undermining its own. That leaves Taiwan with a balancing act: preserve the claim, avoid unnecessary confrontation, protect the relationship. That is why I would use the term strategic compartmentalization. Taiwan does not need to surrender its territorial position to cooperate with the Philippines. It can maintain the claim while keeping the dispute from overwhelming a much more important strategic relationship. And that brings us to the central argument of this entire story. Taiwan may be separating what it claims from what it needs. It needs the Philippines to remain a stable and cooperative part of the regional security environment. But it still wants its South China Sea claims preserved. That is not a retreat. It is a calculation about priorities. And the final question is whether this balancing act can actually survive the next major crisis. 3 scenarios are possible. First, pragmatic coexistence. Taiwan keeps its claim to Scarborough Shoal but avoids a direct confrontation with Manila, allowing the territorial dispute to remain while the relationship develops. Second, China tightens control if Beijing expands its presence around the shoal or further restricts Philippine access. Taiwan could face growing pressure to take a stronger position. Third, a Taiwan Strait crisis. If conflict erupts, the Philippines' geography, the Bashi Channel, and U.S. access could make Manila critically important to Taiwan. Taiwan is not abandoning Scarborough Shoal. It is separating its territorial claims from its strategic priorities. The claim remains on Taiwan's map, but increasingly, the Philippines is part of Taiwan's strategic map. And the bigger conclusion, Scarborough Shoal may be a territorial dispute on the map, but the Philippines itself is becoming part of Taiwan's strategic map.